Thanks very much, Andy. Thanks to all of you for coming. I'm conscious this you could spend your next hour and a half doing something else, and you're here. So I'm thank you for giving up whatever else you would be doing to come and hear well, not just what I have to say, but what the rest of the panel, but also the rest of you as well. My special thanks to ODI for inviting me. I think at least 6 other organizations have been able to shamelessly free ride on the generosity of that you've extended to me by bringing me over here from Washington, and I think I could speak on behalf of those organizations to thank you as well for making that possible. I am going to talk, as Andy indicated, about some of the ways in which the science of delivery agenda is playing out at the bank right now. It's a live issue. It's by no means settled. We will know more each day and each week as we head to the 1st of July when the reorganization of the bank officially is concluded on paper, but obviously remains to be seen in the months that follow after that, really how that's all going to play out. But one of the big issues that has come out of that, I hope, one is a much more sustained and serious engagement with questions around implementation, around delivery, about how we make stuff happen. I'll go into some more detail of this shortly, but I think it's true to say, certainly in the world, or the slice of development that I populate, that the prestige, the heavy lifting, or the cool kids do the designing and the evaluating. And that's how you get promoted, that's how you get published, that's how you get known. The people who actually work for years and years in obscurity delivering on all of these topics around the virtues or vices of conditional cash transfers, of malaria nets, of vitamin supplements, whatever it is. That's what we talk about, but we give much less space, much less recognition to the people who actually do this work. And I hope that for all of the other debates that we might have about these issues, that putting implementation back as not just as a serious and legitimate contribution to development, but as a place wherein real knowledge is acquired and real knowledge can be used and learned from as a basis for improving our programming. So I think that's one of the big things that will come out of this change, I hope. The second is a focus on the fragile states, the ways in which we engage with the bottom 35 or so countries of the world that that's for various different reasons are unable or unwilling to be able to respond to the immediate political and domestic imperatives of their own countries, but by extension have become almost by definition very problematic partners for a lot of the interventions, the projects and ideas that we come up with in development, and everybody comes up with in development. So those two big things, I hope, for all the other inevitable imperfections and grumpiness that might accompany a big institutional change, a reintegration, a refocusing on the importance of implementation, and wrestling more seriously than we have with the particular idiosyncratic circumstances of fragile states, and by extension trying to, as a third contribution perhaps, also trying to move back into, in some sense, more traditional concerns in development about big picture questions around agriculture, around energy, around urban-rural migration, around justice and security. These are big issues that I think in the 21st century have tended to fall away a bit as we've become increasingly focused on very targeted interventions for the specific plight of specific people living in specific places, which is, of course, is a very important issue, but I think putting as much intellectual and political energy back into really thinking about these bigger picture questions is really what is necessary as well. So a focus on implementation and a focus on the big picture should pretty quickly take most of us back, I hope, to people like Albert Hirschman, who in his book Journeys Towards Progress wrote that the very term implementation itself understates the complexity of the task of carrying out projects that are affected by a high degree of initial ignorance and uncertainty. Here, project implementation may often mean, in fact, a long voyage of discovery in the most varied domains, from technology to politics. So if we could just revisit and re-engage with that very powerful truth, I think, about development itself as a long journey of discovery, around recognizing that implementation is about engaging with deep uncertainty, with problems that are, and the solutions which are often unknown and unknowable ex ante. I think we'd find ourselves in a very different epistemological space, a very different policy space for thinking about how we define what development problems are, how we imagine what solutions might be, and correspondingly what kinds of intellectual and social scientific tools we might bring to bear on trying to assess the efficacy of any of those things. So that's kind of some of the big picture stuff. So what I'm going to do is just start off by talking about what I think the science of delivery could mean. It's, as Andy indicated, it's still very much a bit of an open space at the moment for waiting to be populated. But here's what I think it should be, at least. And I'll talk then about what I think some of the inherent and structural reasons are why this is so problematic for development agencies in general, and for development agencies trying to implement what we will call complex projects for which there are many different components, parts that make it inherently very likely that you will get very variable impacts even when faithfully implemented, even when put into a supportive context. And I'll draw on some of my own research in this in that point. And then I'll make a case for why I think building state capability for implementation is the 21st century task. And I'll try to make an empirical case for that. I'll try to make a historical case for that. But essentially argue that if we're going to work seriously with middle-income countries, if we're going to be working seriously with fragile states, that the common element among all those is figuring out how to make not just the science of delivery agenda work, making that work ultimately will rest on the extent to which we engage seriously with building the capability of the state to perform, in the first instance, its most rudimentary functions, its most logistical, non-controversial tasks, but incrementally the much more complicated and contested tasks that states undertake as the process of development succeeds, not just as much when it is under stress. So I'll talk about some of that, and then look at some of the work that I've been doing with Lant Pritchard and Matt Andrews, which some of you may have heard of, around what we're calling problem-driven iterative adaptation. And I'll talk about that very briefly, since that's not explicitly what this talks about as such. But I do want to give enough of a flavor of that so that we have a sense for what I'll then do is just conclude with some examples of how we've tried to make this manifest in some fragile states in which our Justice for the Poor program is working. So that's the map for where we're going to go. That's the journey of discovery that I want to take us on for the next 40 minutes or so. So when we talk about science of delivery, I'm going to sort of focus on the two key words, science and delivery. And what I think science fundamentally is mechanisms plus theory, which is to say, when we often talk about trying to explain how things happen in the world, we're trying to explain what we often call the black box, and black box kind of indicates symbolically that we kind of don't know what's going on, and science is kind of about shrinking the black box, right? So one of the common examples that's often used is, about in the 1800s or so, people figured out that stopping scurvy could happen by eating citrus fruits, and so citrus fruits, eating them led to a reduction in scurvy. The black box is pretty big because we didn't actually know how that happened, and science comes along and starts to shrink that box, and someone comes up with something called vitamin C, and now we've got a smaller box and a more mechanisms-based explanation of what it is that these things called citrus fruits contain. It's this thing called vitamin C, and this is what stops you getting rickets and scurvy and all these other nasty conditions that happen to sailors that didn't have adequate forms of citrus fruits in their diets. So that's a simple explanation, but that's what I think a scientist always try to do, is to try and shrink that space of uncertainty so that we actually have a fully mechanisms-based explanation of how things happen. But evidence is never self-evident. Evidence also has to always be explained and used as hopefully as a form of prediction if our explanations are really, really good. So putting together mechanisms in a theory is largely what I think science is, and delivery is about implementation, and that can vary enormously in our field. We can implement relatively straightforward things like building schools and designing textbooks and counting the number of chalk that we need to quantify to make sure that every teacher in Nigeria has the adequate resourcing to do this thing called education. So we can do that, and we can set up things like Millennium Development Goals where we measure education by straightforward things like enrollment. butts on seats measures, as Lant Pritchett calls it. Right? Or we can see implementation as about doing the really hard things that also are in this space called education, which is educating people. It's having teachers show up for 6 hours a day, for 200 days a year, for 12 years, to turn my little bratty son into someone that is actually a minimally functional citizen that can live and work and earn a living, right? That's a lot of hours of transaction when you do the math. And in the collective, number of people in this room, how many teaching hours did it take to get us to a point where we can have this kind of conversation? Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of hours, right? So that's the hard part of education, making that stuff happen. And as we know from some of the most recent research, we can kind of do a pretty good job on getting kids to enroll in school and to sit inside a building called a school. But we also know that people can sit there for years of their life and pretty much learn nothing. And I think the 21st century challenge is to go from, in development at least, from a world where we seem to focus, as we often do, on doing the logistical, relatively non-complicated, easy to log frame, easy to Excel spreadsheet tasks, and take on some of the much more messy, inherently messy tasks of how we deliver systems that can actually educate people, that can help people healthy, that can deal with competing claims in the justice sector or whatever. So I hope that the science delivery then is about trying to bring together those sort of different dimensions and mechanisms, good theory, combined with a sensibility for and a recognition of the fact that much of what we do to actually implement things in development requires a combination of things that are relatively straightforward with doing things that are relatively non-straightforward. Indeed, are not just hard in an intellectual sense, but are hard in the sense that you meet deep, consistent resistance to trying to do what you're trying to do. Right? As I'll explain shortly or just demonstrate shortly, probably the easiest task that governments perform, for example, is delivering the mail, right? Entirely logistical tasks that computers now can do increasingly large amounts of, but no one stands at your front door with a loaded gun resisting the actions of the postal Royal Mail deliverer doing their tasks. People do stand with loaded guns at borders trying to stop people to cross. They do, in effect, try to prevent powerful companies from being regulated. They do try and prevent criminal gangs from being captured. There are things that states do that aren't just logistics, aren't just straightforward routine tasks. There are ones that are deeply difficult where frontline workers face very powerful incentives to actually not do what they think what the rest of us would like them to do. We call that corruption, but nonetheless, those issues are very pervasive. So that's what I want to try and sort of use as a platform then for talking about some of the different tasks that we face in development. Now, I've already mentioned this point that I think these kind of issues are very hard because the way in which our aid architecture is structured is largely set up to put the prestige and the power in the hands of people that design things and people that evaluate things, right? So we're in a world now where most of the policy debate is whether X works, where X is anything from conditional cash transfers to malaria nets to everywhere else. That's the debate. Or at an even higher level of abstraction, we're debating whether aid works, right? So that's sort of how the public discourse around a lot of this issue happens. Or in the works space, you have people running all sorts of experiments or randomized controlled trials, whatever, and imputing to themselves great powers of authority, Caesar-like, to sort of say, yes, this works, no, this doesn't. And you can now consult various different websites to get 5-star rating sort of treatment around things that are deemed by the research community to work. And the hapless policymaker is supposed to consult these different options to see what among the options they have on the table, which one the research community has deemed to work. That's a whole separate discussion I won't get into, but if you're hanging out in Cambridge, Massachusetts or in Berkeley, California, this is the kind of the way development debate goes. We beat each other up over who has the best identification strategy for showing causally whether intervention X is the causal agent driving the outcome observed Y, and all the big black box part of it is largely left unexamined. Right? A science of delivery, to go back to how I defined it before, would take much more of that black box kind of stuff seriously, would recognize that to get from input to outcome, a whole bunch of transactions have to take place, some of which are reducible to fairly routinized transactions, like United Parcel Service in the United States, which has as its slogan, what? we heart logistics, right? We can get parcels anywhere on the planet within 24 hours because of this wondrous apparatus for putting parcels all around the planet. But you can do that when you have a problem and an instrumentality that can respond to that particular issue in that particular way. The seduction and the temptation of development is to imagine that most of the other problems we deal with are kind of like that, more or less, or if we only thought about them hard enough, then they would be. When in fact they're qualitative. Many of these governance questions and justice problems are in fact qualitatively different. Now, lest we beat up too much on our aid architecture, at this point I will channel Charles Kenny and sort of recognize that many of the things that we do in development have in fact been spectacularly successful. In fact, in the space of the lifetime of everybody in this room, we have all been witnesses to unprecedented levels of historical improvement in everything from life expectancy and education levels and the ending of pandemics and crippling diseases. Of the 20th century, life expectancy has doubled. We should, as development people, should have a fairly familiar handle, I hope, on the fact that whether we've causally been part of that process or not, at least development as a historical process itself has been remarkably successful over the course of the 20th century. At least that's one story one can tell, and it's well established, I think, in even the most recent work of Angus Deaton and Steven Pinker. A whole bunch of people have been weighing in on this kind of stuff. And if you go back even a little further to a vastly underappreciated book in my view, but Rob Fergel's Nobel Prize-winning book from 10 years ago now called The Escape from Hunger and Premature Death basically says you can look at economic history as a 400-year game, and we're in the beginning the fourth quarter of that game. But if current trends continue, then we will have gone. History will show that we will have this 400-year window when most of the world's people were poor, to a world in which most people weren't. But I think there's still very much an open question as to whether whether the demographic trends will indeed continue, and that will be in this period that will be recognized with the benefit of hindsight as a period in which a qualitative transformation took place across the world, or a world in which we, Frankenstein-like, created a machine that we didn't understand and that had kind of fried the planet, or we blew ourselves up, or we all put ourselves back into the Dark Ages, which history says is entirely possible as well. But I think from an empirical point of view, what is far more source of anxiety at this point is the fact that we live at the tail end of this period where there's just wild divergence. What Lent many years ago in a paper called Divergence Big Time, it's just only on steroids as in the course of the last 10 years or so, these huge big sort of tripartite gaps that we see in the world between rich countries that are doing spectacularly well, an interesting and important group of China, India kind of countries that are starting to see the kink in the curve starting to occur, and then a third group of countries that even if absolutely things are improving, which they are in most cases, still the gaps between the bottom and the top just accelerating relentlessly. Now, one can tell pretty good stories about development in the economic growth space, in the education space, in the health space, in the rights space, in the ending of wars space. The seeming paradox that, again, I won't go into great detail here, but the one area where there's been persistent lack of improvement is in the quality of institutions and organizations in developing countries. So I've got an indicative slide here using quality of governance data compiled by Bo Rustine and his colleagues in Gothenburg in Sweden. And if you look at the data that they have on nearly 100 countries, you can, with the part that I've got circled at the bottom there, you'll see just using their data they have over the last over the period last 10-year period rather, from 98 to 2008, 68 of the 98 countries in the world are either falling or falling fast. Right now, one can tell a whole could quibble with some of that and want to question some of the finer methodological details, but if you use not just the quality of governance data, but a range of other sources that we have for telling, or trying to provide an account of the trajectory of the effectiveness of organizations around the world, it's still a pretty consistent story of flatlining or worse for most of the countries in which we hope it would be going in the opposite direction. Now, initially, this poses a bit of a paradox. How can we, on the one hand, tell a very upbeat story about lowering infant mortality rates, about more kids in schools, and wars ending, and all that sort of stuff, with a world in which simultaneously the organizations that notionally would preside over all of this seem to be flatlining or declining? I think there is a good explanation for that, which I won't go into because my time is tight, and I want to move on to the fragile states. But my short answer is that I think that we've plucked a lot of low-hanging fruit. I think we've stopped doing horrible things to each other. We don't have great leap forward kinds of mass atrocities being undertaken in the name of development. Wars empirically are ceasing. We've stopped doing some of these en masse, at least, some of these horrible things to each other. And there are unambiguous gains to immunizing babies, to give vitamin supplements, all of the relatively straightforward things to do that can literally save lives and enable people to live longer and to have better diets. A lot of that is actually happening. But one of the reasons I will now move to argue for why institution building, or particularly building state capability, is the 21st century development challenge, is that it matters in two fundamentally key ways for countries that are still in this bottom left quadrants, for countries that demonstrably are just not seeing their own governments perform better. But even in the countries that are succeeding, in the middle income countries, and in China and India, but I'll give a specific example of China shortly, all that's going to happen as these countries become more developed is the importance of having a high quality and effective state will only improve. Right? We can we can literally parachute in schools and hospitals. We can train up sort of people to work at the front line on some of these things. We can set up parallel mechanisms in some cases in refugee type situations to deal with some of the most egregious instances of human suffering. But for a country to be a country and to fulfill many of the ambitions that its visionaries had upon the ending of the colonial era, that will only really happen if a viable state is being constructed. And so my contention is that largely, whether we're talking about the fragile states or the middle income states, the state capability question really must be at the center of what we worry about in this early part of the 21st century. And the pace for many of these countries is not just flatlining, but it's glacially slow. So the particularly outrageous example, if you use Haiti, for example, we can plot its improvement notionally over a 200-year period, since that's when it became independence. But if you looked at when it would become Singapore and extrapolated those lines, for example, it's sort of 3 blocks down the street before those lines start to overlap. Even if you use the fastest even if tomorrow somehow Haiti could improve its institutional quality at the pace of the fastest 20 countries, it would still take another 100 years for that to happen. In the calculation we did for the World Development Report a few years ago, we showed that getting a 1 standard deviation improvement in the rule of law in developing countries for the best 20 countries would still take on average 42 years, right? So this is this is 2 careers worth essentially of persistent action that it takes to get these kinds of improvement. And that's again why I want to stress this need to wrestle with these big picture questions, because if development gets defined down, if people in development see exclusively that their task is largely just to help particular targeted groups move from one place in a distribution to a few points higher up, that's great for those people, and that's a very noble way of using your time. But the big development questions that will seismically move entire populations out of poverty require a much full-on engagement with the institutions that will enable things like unemployment insurance and the National Health Service and all the other things that we're now hardwired into our world to make it possible for people to not live lives of destitution. Those are big, major institutional accomplishments, and part of the reason to invoke the book that Andy mentioned before, why I did a book on history and development policy, was to try and raise people's consciousness about how long and how painful it was to construct something like the National Health Service, how painful it was to get women the vote, how long and painful it was to try and construct unemployment insurance, minimum wage, safe working conditions in factories. These things were long, painful struggles that we airbrush out of history because no one in this room, I should imagine, has a lived memory of what conditions before those kinds of times were like. And I think part of our education as development professionals needs to be far more cognizant of just how difficult and how taken for granted so much of the state effectiveness issues are in our own lives. They are a real and present issue for most of the rest of the world. Now, so we struggle on these big, complicated tasks, but we struggle even on really simple ones. And so I can just, for the sake of argument, and I know there's any number of different topologies one can use in this space, but just look at simple logistics tasks. And I've got a slide, the next one, so I'll save my, actually I'll go straight to it. It's a great slide. Some of my colleagues at Harvard did this really nice experiment where they wanted to test the effectiveness of the postal service in 157 countries around the world. And so what they did was to send out 10 letters that had a nonsensical address to each of those countries. And each of those 157 countries were signatories to an international agreement which says, simply, if you receive gobbledygooked address, return to sender, right? Look at envelope, see gobbledygook address, put back in basket from whence letter came. That is your task. Okay, so they did that with 1,570 letters that they sent out across to the countries of the world, and Czechs and the Finns and the Uruguayans and the Colombians win the prize for having the country that, and this little micro stress test experiment, were able to get 90% or more of the letters back. But once you get down to the very poorest countries, the fragile states kind of countries, we're looking at many of them that just didn't send back at all. And it's not just the fragile states, even places like Nigeria and Russia and other places that you might think had at least a history of something resembling of an effective postal service, even those places were a black hole as far as your letters were concerned, right? So again, this is state 101, right? Non-controversial, entirely logistical, and this is the capability to perform that we're measuring. Now, again, this is one little thing. It's indicative, but I think it's pretty powerfully indicative of where we in development in our language around rights and empowerment and all the other things. These are really hard things to do, right? We're talking about delivering the mail, which nobody objects to, which is entirely logistical, and even that is often very much underperforming. Let alone by the time we go to joining Susan B. Anthony and Gandhi and Rosa Parks and Nelson Mandela and trying to really, really change the seriously contested, viciously entrenched political and economic interests that rule the world, right? So most of our language most of our historical memory is lost around all of these kind of issues. I would suggest that variants of these kind of challenges are very much what are going on in their own way, or at least the degree of sophistication required of a government to be able to respond to these kinds of things is something that we need to have a much better handle on. So, as for reasons I've just argued, I think this is why this is the 21st century development challenge, and it's only going to get harder, not easier, as the low-hanging fruit gets plucked, and as the development process writ large just unfolds, as all these growth processes and globalization, etc., does its thing. As Danny Roderick and others have showed over a long period of time, governments become more necessary as you become more integrated, not less. As your economy gets larger and more, as the division of labor expands, you need a more robust government, not a less government. And I think that if that logic carries out to 7 billion people, that's why I'm arguing for why we need to have this as a much more high priority issue than we do. But of course, the challenge is that we don't really kind of know what to do. Everybody in this room can nod in serious agreement about the importance of good governance, about building the rule of law, about having a rights-based approach to development, etc., etc. But none of that really maps onto a verified set of instruments that will enable us to jump on an airplane and head off to Mongolia or the Central African Republic tomorrow to roll out a policy program that would actually have some verified basis on which we could imagine that it would actually work. And if you haven't, I strongly encourage you to get at least get a sense of what Matt Andrews, my colleague and friend Matt Andrews, argues in his book, The Limits of Institutional Reform, which just looks very powerfully at just how often and how difficult it actually is to go from notional agreements around these issues to trying to actually make them work. And it's hard enough even in the things that we all agree on. It's hard enough just to actually build the schools. It's hard enough to actually pave roads. It's hard enough to do the logistical engineering, accounting kinds of tasks. Once we move into this space that around justice, around governance, around all of the highly contested problems for which there is no known or knowable solution up front, or rather, or another way of putting it, saying when solutions can only come and emerge through a political process deemed to be legitimate and equitable, then no one has a toolkit for that, and we won't ever have a toolkit for that, and yet we still have to engage with it. And I think that's the conundrum that we really have to engage with. It's one that we also need to have a willingness and ability to be able to engage with a much broader array of knowledge sources and knowledge claiming if we are to respond to it effectively. So, as I've indicated, once we move into this world of doing programs like community-driven development at the World Bank, justice and governance, these are just really, really hard to get a handle on empirically. It's very hard to generalize on the basis of any of this, and the learning that comes out of that is often very idiosyncratic. This comes out from a book that I did a couple of years ago with some colleagues over a long period of time in Indonesia, tracking and throwing pretty much every social scientific methodology and theory we could to try and look at the ways in which a local community empowerment program, well, it was operating locally, it was actually a national program, 100,000 villages, a huge big program, called the Kecamatan Development Program, KDP. And this was a program conceived and implemented in the aftermath of the fall of the Suharto government. But without going into all the details of the book, which is a separate presentation, for present purposes, the point was, as per this table, that there wasn't any singular KDP effect. We desperately wanted there to be, at least the knowledge communities and policy worlds in which we frequent wanted there to be a story about, does this work? And the verified answer was, well, it depends. Right? So in the bottom right, when you see that where the context capacity was high, which is to say that there was receptivity on the part of local politicians and local leaders to work with this program, when it was well implemented, and when it was able to find the right local institutional channels in and through which to work, yeah, worked great. Exactly the same people implementing exactly the same program a mile away in an area where they just really couldn't mobilize people in a implementation effective way, where there was deep resistance and sometimes overt hostility on the part of local officials to notions of transparency and accountability and empowerment and other nice words we use in development, and who used every fair means and foul they could to erode the credibility and effectiveness of the program. It actually, a few instances actually caused some quite severe conflict, right? So this huge array, did this project work? Well, under what conditions did it work should be the right question that we were really trying to argue, and having a sense of being able to document this high variability, this enormous range of ways in which this project can work, and the conditions under which different combinations of factors would lead to particular outcomes being obtained and not others, was a really central argument we were making, but also one we were trying to link to on the basis of the empirical work we'd done, and then ultimately to connect this to a broader theory of development. Now, why was this is relevant not just in terms of trying to get us away from an axiomatic assumption that projects do or don't work. They will work in the aggregate because we can create an average, but most of the real interest is in the standard deviation and the fact that there is this variability. And as we move now into looking at what the implications of this are for fragile states, I want to argue that most of the real learning about projects can happen by having a serious platform in place that can help us to understand that variability, to document it, to interrogate it, to learn from it, and to feed it back into the way in which programs are playing out over time. So, put more simply and graphically, if you start with a baseline at T0, these projects have big variability, right? Complex projects working in complex environments where there's lots of space for discretion on the part of frontline implementers, where there's lots of ways in which the local political elites can support or actively resist what is going on. There's going to be this high variability. And you can construct an average, in this case here, to show that on average, yes, this is working. But if you're an NGO and you're particularly concerned about the plight of a particular group in a particular places, and you happen to be living in below the red line, then this project is diabolical. Right? It's actually not vastly under-succeeding. In some cases, might actually be making people's lives worse off. And a lot of the politics of development, as Ravi Kanbor articulated in a nice paper after his experience with the World Development Report in 2000, you know, what you see depends on where you stand. And when poverty is an abstraction in a big national level data set, it's one thing. When you're a frontline worker for Oxfam or Save the Children, it's something else because you're dealing with dying babies, and the fact that the project isn't working in your village is enough to make you get legitimately really angry and want to try and change that, right? And so part of the politics of development is about trying to look at all this stuff. But once we're talking about complex projects, these standard deviations are hardwired into the very logic of what they're doing. They're not malaria nets, they're not vitamin supplements, they're not immunizations, which we have where the mechanisms are shrunk down, where we do have a really true science of how immunization works, and we can predict with a high degree of certainty that if we inject kids with this particular substance that they will not get polio, right? We can't do that. We haven't got that kind of science, that kind of mechanisms underpinning so much of what we do in the governance and political space, and we never will. At least I don't want to live in a world in which we think we've nailed that kind of problem down to something that that makes social science as clinical as something that might be done by actual clinical scientists. Nonetheless, part of what has come about through work in epidemiology and what we've been trying to push a bit with our this problem-driven iterative adaptation approach is to say, let's learn from that variability rather than see it as a problem with a project or as something that reflects weakness on the part of the less than stellar implementation on the frontline people or the design even of the project itself. Let's concede that up front it's often going to be pretty unsure at all what anybody should or might do with that space, and start off with a prototype, as it were, that you can iterate over time and make work better. That's hard in a world where we see evaluation exclusively as this punctuated process which happens after a period of time and a SWAT team shows up to make a decision about whether it did or didn't work. And it's also very hard in a world in which we see randomized control trials per se as the dominant modality in which we make claims about effectiveness, because the whole logic of an RCT requires what's called the unit homogeneity assumption, that everybody in the treatment and control group has to receive identical things over the course of the life of the project, and you compromise the entire integrity of the project if you actually make adaptations along the way, because that's not how it works. So try to think about how we engage within the complex space, not in a way that is dismissive of RCTs as such, but say we need an attitude of experimentation rather than experiments to really think about how we engage with complex projects, and trying to figure out how over time we iterate and adapt so that the groups that are less able to accommodate or less successful start to move in a more positive direction. And that requires, I think, a much more concerted effort around the M in M&E, around monitoring, which we often usually see as a compliance and disciplining tool, rather see it as a learning tool that can be used to make these iterative changes along the way. Now, that's the analytics of it. That isn't just something that Harvard professors cook up and then try and sell. It's born of, it partly is, but it's also born of the experience that I and my colleagues have had of trying to do this kind of stuff in a range of different sectors in a range of different countries, and seeing pretty consistently that attempts to try and double down on design up front and then stick rigidly to design upon implementation in the name of upholding the purity of the methodology, or trying to fake your way to progress by making you look like you've made changes when in fact you really haven't, a process we call isomorphic mimicry. All of this way of proceeding just has to be subverted in some constructive way. And one operationally relevant way of doing that, I think, is to try and have a much more concerted focus on using monitoring data and seeing it as a real-time source of feedback. That, in fact, was one of the big conclusions out of this massive big project in Indonesia, by the way, which took the M part really, really seriously. And its designers were very conscious right from the outset that there was going to be this big variability. You don't run a national program in a country with 350 languages like Indonesia and expect that there's going to be this nice, beautiful input-output logic that sort of says, if we did this, we're going to get that. They knew right from the beginning that there was this huge, big heterogeneity happening as a result of doing that, and through a very innovative set of feedback mechanisms, we're able to ensure that over time the whole program as itself was a learning organization in Peter Stenge's sense. It was a way of being able to ensure that not just individual frontline people, but the whole system itself was able to move in a more progressive direction. If you want sort of formal models behind that, I'll just quickly talk about one really cool study I came across a couple of years ago, which was a modeling showdown between using sort of verified best practice tools versus making it up as you go along. That's the vernacular of randomized controls trials versus quality implementation collaboratives done by a bunch of computer scientists and public health people and a whole bunch of different authors. This wonderful thing. But in essence, what they were basically testing was saying that if the problem you face can look like two different types. It can look like the Gaza pyramids, which are symmetrical, uniform, in all ways even, or you can try and climb the Matterhorn, which is an idiosyncratic mountain. All right? And if you want to go from the bottom to the top, what's the best way to do it? Should you just follow a formula? Read up on what all the great climbers have said is the best way to climb a mountain and just follow that no matter what? Or should you just take off little bits of it as you go along and climb your way up? And the short version is, if you use RCTs, if you want to climb Gaza, anything else that even starts to have 2 or 3 bricks removed from the side of the pyramid start to have a much more collaborative approach to what you're doing. Beautiful modeling, beautiful empirical stuff. I love it when people can do this stuff, because it really actually provides a very firm foundation on which to think about the kinds of problems we face in development. A handful of them are kind of Gaza pyramid things. We desperately, desperately want them all to be like that. Actually, most of them are pretty idiosyncratic. They're kind of similar, Matterhorns and Everest, and yeah, the mountains are kind of a mountain. There is a genuine thing called mountaineering skill, which you can acquire, and that you can internalize that, but it's pretty hard to share it with other people. The only way you learn how to be a good mountaineer is to climb a bunch of mountains and bruise a lot of knees and figure out how to actually do it. And I think that's metaphorically or allegorically a way to think about a lot of the stuff we do in this complex space. It's just really hard. And you only learn it by doing it the hard way, the same way we learn to walk, the same way we learn to speak a language, the same way we learn to play a musical instrument. It's just ugly when you start out, and if you stick at it long enough, maybe you get a little better. And I think one of the wonders of modernity is that we live in this incredibly complicated institutional space, which we just take for granted in the same way we take speaking for granted. We have no clue that the wonders of what's happening when air passes over my larynx right now and it touches your ears and you understand what I'm saying. It's a marvelous human invention. And doing complicated things organizationally so that we get trains to run on time, so that you can stick a card in a machine and get money out of it. Those are all just amazing marvels of human invention. And they're skills that are learned and acquired, and it took a hell of a long time to acquire it, and it's going to, for trying to inculcate those similar skills elsewhere, is going to take, hopefully not as long, but it's not something that you can just cut and paste and transform in a straightforward way.
Mike, can you try and wrap up?
I'm going to get 5. Okay, backing me up. Okay, so in essence, a lot of this stuff, PDA stuff, you've heard me give examples of that. It's essentially a contrast between sort of business as usual as done through big organizations like Deaton and the World Bank. And it's also different, I think, from how a lot of NGOs do work as well. So I won't want to make a case for that. Now, what I do want to do is use these examples from fragile states as a way of instantiating how this might work. Okay, because I think the way I've described it at this point, and if one was to have a self-critique in many respects of this, is saying you're actually describing a really complicated process. Isn't that by definition going to be really hard for a fragile state itself to do some of these things? Yes, is the short answer, but not. We've got to start somewhere. And I think what we've been able to see from a range of different country experiences that we've had so far is that even in some of these less likely places, there is always variability. There is always some group somewhere, somehow, that's figured out how to do something a little bit better. And one of the things that external agencies can do is actually to document that, to explain it, to provide some evidence around it, to try and use it and feed it back into the way in which decisions are being made. So one of the things I hope will come out of not just the work we're doing, but one of the very encouraging aspects of this is I think we're actually in the midst of a minor social movement revolution around thinking a lot of this stuff. Maybe it's just because of the invitations I get, but there's an amazing number of people, including people in this room, who in one way or another have been articulating development like this for varying lengths of time, some cases their whole career, sometimes more recently. But this is starting to become, I hope, the beginnings of a minor revolution in terms of how we think about this stuff. And the acid test for a lot of this stuff will be whether and how it can start to provide some traction both into really big, hard questions that countries like Nigeria, India, and China are dealing with, but also whether it can help us deal with the fragile states. One way in which we're trying to do that, at least in the World Bank, is at sort of a twofold level. One is to respond to a recent challenge put to us by a review of the World Bank's own fragile states portfolio, which explicitly calls for a whole new metric for just an analytic structure for how we define and determine who is and who is not fragile in what particular way. That's pretty seismic. That's a pretty big deal, right? If we take that seriously and are actually able to respond to that. One of the things we hope that will come out of that will be a recognition that, in fact, we will generate a formal trigger for recognizing that doing business in fragile states will require a different modality. We cannot just assume that BAU, business as usual type strategies with all of the complicated structures and adherence to strict rules that characterize that is going to be able to be working in these countries. We need a formal trigger that will enable a very different kind of approach to happen. As it happens, a lot of that is already happening through the goodwill or bravery or entrepreneurship on the part of individual country managers. But to go from a world of idiosyncrasy and brave individuals to a world in which this is much more routinized in terms of how we work will require responding in very creative and broad-based ways, broad in the sense of building a broader social coalition around this to try and really change how we define, determine, and respond to these really difficult situations in fragile states. What we've also tried to do, though, not just in terms of just this, these problems can't just and shouldn't be just imagined that they can be fixed just by tinkering with the analytics at the top. The credibility of a lot of that turns ultimately on whether and how people can make stuff really work in a lot of these countries. In that spirit, I really encourage you to look at a website set up at Princeton on the Initiative for Successful Societies run by Jennifer Widener, good friend and colleague of ours who's really set up a whole work program assembling hundreds of case studies, many from fragile states, looking at these islands of success in seas of failure. Why, in the most of seeming despair and hopelessness, have teams of people been able to figure out actually how to make something work, right? I go back to this, what I said before about iteration, around learning from the context itself as being a central part of what's being done. Here, the game is not about trying to find the best practice solution and import it on the basis of what MIT professors have deemed to be the way in which we can rigorously respond to this problem. It's saying, let's start with what's already going on. Let's look at what domestic actors are already doing in response to this particular challenge and figure out how we can learn from that, in the first instance internally, but perhaps more broadly beyond that. In the work we've been doing in the Solomon Islands, which I'll conclude with, as well as in Sierra Leone, which other people on the panel will talk about, these were fragile states, countries that are emerging from civil war, countries in which one might initially be very skeptical about the capacity of governments to do anything, let alone to be able to move forward. The story in Sierra Leone is an incredibly remarkable and happy story from a country in the midst of civil war 15 years ago, now about to be graduated, as it were, from fragile states into a non-fragile state. And others can talk about that. I just want to use one very concrete example of the kind of stuff our Justice for the Poor program has been doing in the Solomon Islands. If you go to the Solomon Islands and go to one of the outside of the capital city, Honiara, to one of the outlying islands, you will see this beautiful building. This beautiful building is a product of a regional assistance mission, the group of countries in the South Pacific that pooled resources to try and respond to the civil war that occurred in that country 12 years or so ago. Now, what was deemed to be the problem? The absence of the rule of law, right? Bad governance, all right? So what was the modal way in which money was able to be procured and in which money was able to be spent in response to that particular challenge? One of it was to build this beautiful courthouse in the island of Malaita. That building, I can assure you, is eco-friendly, locally sourced, created lots of local jobs, is situated just so that it captures breezes off the prevailing ocean winds so that it doesn't need air conditioning. It is a marvel of modern engineering, right? It cost about $280 million. And has met 3 times in its 3 years of its existence. Right? Does it look like what a modern court system should look like? You betcha. It's a nicer court building than most court buildings you'll find anywhere in the world. Right? But it's something that when orthodoxy gets into a position where it needs to mobilize and spend a hell of a lot of money very quickly, wants to procure it in ways that it's squeaky clean, that will never have accountants hassling and fussing over whether you've done the wrong thing, you can do stuff like this and have nice photo opportunities like happens here, lots of feel-good moments for this building, and have literally zero impact on the prevailing problem that you actually think you're responding to, which is the injustices faced by everyday Solomon Islanders. If you go around the corner from that building, you will see another $100 million jail, which has 8 people inside of it. It has a fitness facility. It has 3 beautiful meals a day because it all has to accord with international norms about da-da-da-da. Right? So this is the logic we've set up, a world in which you can do things that look exactly like what you think what a modern system should look like, but that just do not in any way map onto the prevailing problems that actually everyday Solomon Islanders encounter. So, having talked that up, let me somewhat felicitously sort of talk about what we've tried to do that's very different to that. Justice for the Poor was set up really to try and look at justice issues from a user's perspective. What does it look like from people themselves, everyday citizens of developing countries trying to engage with either their own immediate informal justice system, or more problematically oftentimes trying to engage with the very imperfect, impartial, partially funded, partially populated justice sector that they would encounter. In rural Sierra Leone, for example, there are 2 lawyers, 2 formally trained lawyers. Right? That's 8 million people trying to deal with 2 people to meet as their gatekeepers into the formal justice sector. With justice delivered locally, a project that has now come out of this particular work, all began with an attempt to try and document the nature and extent of justice problems as actually encountered by the citizens of Sierra Leone. No one had ever done a survey like that before, because real lawyers and real engineers show up to build courthouses. But to actually engage with the problems that people encounter requires having people reside in countries for years at a time, not on 2-week missions. Requires people to be able to do good enough research, nothing that's going to get published in some fancy journal, but something that's real time enough to be useful and usable by policymakers, and more importantly to feed into a public dialogue about actually what is the justice problems that we as a community face, or that we as a citizenry face. How can that be then a basis by which a broader based political conversation takes place with regard to how resources are prioritized, what kinds of problems are prioritized, and what kinds of solutions then get imagined, enacted, implemented, and assessed. So when you start from the bottom and don't just see your problem as responding to the very narrow concerns of particular people, but see these at a national level as emblematic of the broader failings of a system of justice to actually encounter and respond to the needs of people themselves, you have a very different modality of engaging with this. Does this work? Is this better? We can document to our satisfaction at least how that might go. But you can understand, I think, that the way we've structured this game, it's much easier to do things like to build these nice courthouses and jails and everything else. But in these types of situations, they're just very much not mapping onto the actual problems that most people face most of the time. And it's not that social science doesn't have a way of dealing with that. We do. We just haven't. We can't. The structures we've set up and the architecture we work within really conspires against that. And part of what I like to think the energy that's now seeming to be mobilized in a whole range of different countries and a range of different sectors is a recognition that we're not impotent in the face of that. We have a range of examples, a range of experiences we can draw on in neighboring fields. And part of what it means to be a development professional, I hope, in the 21st century is that we're not just consigning ourselves to one particular field or one particular mode of responding, but that we see our task as being able to synthesize and incorporate ideas and evidence and theory from a whole range of different places. And I think that's what we can do, we in the sense of we the professionals who work in nice places like ODI. But part of it is how do we then partner with our counterparts and with citizens as well to be able to respond to that. And I think we can. I think we're starting to get a sense that we can do this, but the system still is structured very differently. And until we get a different system, all the rearranging of boxes in the World Bank's organizational chart really won't fundamentally change that. But you've got to start somewhere, and we're trying to. And I hope you see yourselves as part of that process by which that changes. Thanks.